Howdy readers, I'm Jason. This is Chapter and Verse, and this is a Maybe Midrash video. So I hesitate to call this a review, but I'm gonna be talking with you a little bit about Christian Wiman's book. He held Radical Light, the Art of Faith, the Faith of Art. Getting a little close there, maybe. Okay. So this is a book actually that Steve Donahue sent me. I want to say early last year was when this was published, and he was kind enough to send me his copy of it. He knows I'm a big Christian Wiman fan. Wiman is principally known as a poet, and this book, slim as it is a kind of rambly investigation of, let's call it, the borderland between religious faith and serious literary art. It's not quite a memoir, even though he talks a lot about his own friendships with poets, his own experiences as the editor of Poetry Magazine, which he was for 10 years. I want to say up until around 2010. 2011. It's a strange little book, right? It's part memoir, it's part theology, it's part literary criticism, and it's all rambly, like I said. So it's difficult to know not only what to make of it, I suppose, but also to articulate what I'm thinking about it. So I'm going to do my best. Bear with me. It's a brilliant book. It's a wonderful book, but it's a book that is quite slippery and quite elusive, I think. So let me just start by saying, so I was thinking this morning, I thought, okay, well, what is the thesis of the book? I'm not even really sure I can kind of pin that down, but I listed three things here. It could be argued that the thesis for He Held Radical Light is that religious longing and hunger are present even in the work of poets who are not themselves religious. Okay, so that's part of it. Second thing I wrote down was that poetry obliterates and reforges religious language and sentiment. And this is something that I've seen Christian Wiman talk about at length in interviews on TV. So it was nice to see him exploring it more fully on the page. And the third thing that I wrote down is that poetry is a vessel better suited to hold, convey, and consider religious impulse than the language employed by believers to discuss God, faith, etc. in the 21st century. And there was one passage in particular, one sentence or two in particular, along those lines that I thought was just perfect. He writes on page 94, the casual way that American Christians have of talking about God is not simply dispiriting, but is, for some sensibilities, actively destructive. There are times when silence is not only the highest, but the only possible piety. And I absolutely agree with that. Rick, in his kind of TBR video for Maybe Midrash, I'll link to his channel below, as well as my two co-hosts, Fleetsy at Little Prairie Library and Steve Donahue. But Rick, in his video, talked about what the kind of North American mouthpieces of Christianity have done to gut this religion on this continent, have done to just rip the rug out from under the integrity of it. And I think that's part of what Christian Wiman is on about here. But casting a larger net, I think what he's addressing here is not just the casual way or the language in which or with which American Christians have of talking about God, but I think just the language of the culture itself these days, right? Like there seems to be so much less gravity and so much less thoughtfulness to the words that we use, to the way in which we structure sentences, to the conversations that we have with each other, whether that's face-to-face when there's not a quarantine happening, or even on social media, maybe especially on social media. Like it or not, we live in the world of Twitter, which is unfortunate. I don't have a Twitter account myself. And that has, I think, damaged or subverted the richness of our communication. When we're talking about something that has the import that religion does or can, it's imperative that the language we're using to discuss it rises to meet it somehow. And most of our language in life, just in all that we do in life in the 21st century, does not rise to that level. It falls well short of where it needs to be to explore things of this kind of significance, right? Poetry, art, religion. So it's a long way of saying what I had already said and summed up. The one thing I really kind of want to focus on in this is that point number one, right? The idea, the possibility that the thesis of this book might be that religious longing and hunger are present even in the work of poets who are not themselves religious. That these things are present everywhere and in all of us. So longing and hunger, right? Wiman on page 7 asks, what is it we want when we can't stop wanting? And he addresses this, or on some level answers this, a little bit later in the book on page 41. Hunger for what, though? Ah, the old questions, the old answers, says droll, doomed Ham in Endgame. There's nothing like them. One obvious answer is God, right? Hunger for what? One obvious answer is God, the end in both senses of that word, of all human longing. One devious answer is death, an urge inherent in all organic life to restore an earlier state of things, as Freud put it. One fashionable answer is that there is no answer. It's all just nature, genes rotely ramming home their mechanical codes one by one. We want because dissatisfaction equals survival. We are designed to improve and impart our hunger, breeding descendants with ever keener teeth. If we are conscious and honest, each of these answers will likely seem right at various times of our lives. If we are conscious and honest, each of them at another time will seem wrong. And I think he is right on the money there. In thinking about this idea, this hungering for God, right? So one thing you'll hear Christians talk about sometimes is a kind of God-shaped hole within them, right? This void that is precisely in the shape of God and that only he can fill. And in thinking about this idea, right, of hungering for God, of longing for God, I found myself wondering to what extent or to what degree that longing can ever be satisfied or extinguished. And he addresses this as well, right, throughout the book. One example is here on page 9. Poetry itself, like life, like love, like any spiritual hunger, thrives on longings that can never be fulfilled, and dies when the poet thinks they have been. And I was really, really struck by that, struck by the idea, that this notion that that somehow we've lost the game when in longing for God, we feel sated. We feel like we have found him. We feel like, we have him on a keychain. He's in our back pocket or what have you. This idea that if we reach that point where we feel like we have contained him, encapsulated him, have him with us everywhere as a kind of personal Jesus or what have you, that we've lost the thread. Right, we actually are under the impression that we have finished the game, but we have somehow taken ourselves out of it, and that's not where we want to be. We want to always be searching for God, thirsting for God, and not necessarily finding him. Because if we have found him, then the search is over, right? There is no more hunger for him. There is no more longing for him. Once you've obtained or you possess that which you have been yearning for, something dies, and why would any of us want to see our thirst or our hunger or our yearning for God die? On the very next page, page 10, near the bottom there, he says, "Nothing kills credibility like excessive enthusiasm. Nothing poisons truth so quickly as an assurance that one has found it." Think about that, right? I mean, there are sentences in this book, in all of Christian Wiman's nonfiction, there are sentences that, like if you're careful and you smell, right, you can actually smell the smoke coming out of your ears because your brain is frying a little bit. Let me read that one more time. "Nothing kills credibility like excessive enthusiasm. Nothing poisons truth so quickly as an assurance that one has found it." Right? So when I think of that, nothing kills credibility like excessive enthusiasm, I tend to think of the kinds of Christians that Christians call baby Christians, right? People they tend to be recent converts. There's something really endearing about them. There's something very charming, I suppose, about this kind of naive, wide-eyed wonder that they bring to their new faith. But with baby Christians, the objective needs to be not growing out of that, but growing into a deeper and more complicated and more troublesome faith, frankly. And so when I see people in the public eye, like Kirk Cameron, right, that Kirk Cameron from the 80s TV show, who went on to make the Left Behind films, we won't go there. But Kirk Cameron is still, after decades of being a Christian, he's still a baby Christian, right? He has this, what does Christian Wiman call it? He has this excessive enthusiasm that he has never learned how to temper, that he has never become self-aware of in a way that it would behoove him to become self-aware. And as a result, like Christian Wiman says, it has killed his credibility. So where is Wiman going with this? Where am I going with this? What's the Rush song? Is it Prime Mover? That lyric, the point of a journey is not to arrive. It's the journey itself, okay? I think that's where Christian Wiman is going here. I think that's a really beautiful, profound way of looking at the world, way of approaching belief in God or exploring the possibility of belief in God, is acknowledging how elusive it can be and maybe how elusive it should be. At one point in the book, he quotes in its entirety a poem by A.E. Stallings. He relates it to that moment in the Old Testament when Moses essentially demands to see God. And God, being God, knows that a vision of him would be too much for Moses. And so he gives him just a glimpse, right, of his, quote, back parts. And Moses has to content himself with that. And in this poem by A.E. Stallings, it's about a snake, but it's a perfect metaphor for that story, right? For this idea that we should not want to apprehend God fully, that we should satisfy ourselves with the glimpses that we see of him, and with the act of searching itself. But I loved this poem. Again, it's called Momentariness by A.E. Stallings, so I'm going to read you the whole thing. "I never glimpse her, but she goes, who had been basking in the sun, her links of chainmail, one by one, aglint with pewter, bronze, and rose. I never see her lying coiled atop the garden step, or under a dark leaf, unless I blunder, and by some motion she is foiled. Too late, I notice, as she passes, zither of chromatic scale, I only ever see her tail, quicksilver, into tall grasses. I know her only by her flowing, by her glamour disappearing into shadow as I'm nearing. I only recognize her going. Which is lovely, right? It's just lovely. And if we want to think about this search for God, this hunger for God, as a kind of, we could even look at it as a kind of snake eating its own tail, right? Or a Mobius strip. Something that doesn't necessarily have a beginning and certainly doesn't have an ending. It's a constant process. It's always in motion. On page 111, he has this to say. I have long thought, because I have long felt, that the perfections of art implied or even anticipated some ultimate order one need not call God, but could call out to nonetheless. That a feeling that found its true form could align the heart with the stars, make of remote and implacable matter a mirror in which subject and object might see and even be each other. It's that last bit, again, that I just love dearly. That a feeling that found its true form could make of remote and implacable matter a mirror in which subject and object might see and even be each other. And that set me to thinking about all kinds of things, right? I mean, the idea that man was created in God's image, right? And so there's this kind of, again, this kind of Mobius strip relationship between human beings and God. And by man being created in God's image, I am not at all given to thinking about that in any kind of literal sense. I'm not talking about flesh. I'm not talking about genitals. I'm not talking about hair and bone and blood. I'm talking about soul. And, and if we look at Genesis with Adam and Eve, I'm not thinking about human beings in their corporeality as being like God or created in God's image. I'm thinking of what animates them, what is within them as being created in God's image. And this idea that subject and object, right, creator and the created, that they are witnessing each other, that they're seeing each other, right, and that in the act of that, right, in that tension between subject and object, that they can even become each other somehow, which is really stirring and a little bit kind of chilling and frightening if you think about it. This really reminded me too of the film that I saw recently that I absolutely adored, which was the best film that I saw from last year. If only I'd seen it before I made my video about my favorite films from 2019. And that was Portrait of a Lady on Fire, in which we see a portrait painter and the woman sitting for her portrait. And that film really explores this idea, right, of subject and object witnessing each other and becoming each other, right? The portrait painter comes to realize that, it's not merely her gaze that is at work in trying to understand the character of the woman sitting for the portrait, but the fact that the woman who is sitting for the portrait, who is modeling, during that whole time that she's sitting, she is observing the painter, and she's coming to understand the character of the woman painting her by how she moves her body, by how she changes her breath when she becomes uncomfortable. It's a fascinating film that's very much in keeping with this idea. And then the last thing that I wanted to just bring up along these lines of hungering for God and allowing ourselves to be pursued by God as well, right? Again, right, this idea that it's a kind of cycle at work here. And it's a quote that I wanted to share with you from Michael Cunningham's novel Specimen Days, which I read, God almighty, it was a long time ago, probably 17 years ago, something like this. But I had saved this quote in my commonplace book, and I think about it often. And Wiman's ideas in this slim volume of nonfiction really brought this quote from Michael Cunningham to mind. And in Specimen Days, he wrote, "God is a holy machine that loves us so fiercely, so perfectly, he devours us, all of us. It is what we're here for, to be loved and eaten." which I really like the idea of, right? The idea of hungering for the divine and of allowing ourselves to be consumed by the divine. Yeah, I mean, it's a little alarming, but it's kind of exquisite too, I think. So anyway, those are my random thoughts on Christian Wiman's wonderful book, He Held Radical Light. If you have read it, and I am sure nobody but maybe Ami has read it, let me know what you think in the comments below. And or otherwise, I mean, just let me know how your own Maybe Midrash reading is coming. I know a lot of you are participating in this readathon, which is awesome. If you've been watching any kind of Midrashy films, feel free in the comments below to let me know what those are and what you thought of them. And I will see you guys again very soon. Possibly this week. If not this week, then certainly next weekend in some way, shape, or form. Adios.